Most of the Vikings who operated along the northern coasts of Ireland during the 9th and 10th centuries were likely of Norwegian origin, or descended from Norse settlers. Their sudden expansion at the end of the 8th century has long been debated, yet the answer begins in the landscape of Norway itself. This was not a poor or desperate land. It was rich in natural resources, though shaped by harsh geography. Fertile soil existed, but only in narrow strips along deep fjords and in a few southern lowlands. The mountains dominated everything, vast and often snow-covered, while dense forests stretched across the terrain. These forests supported abundant wildlife such as elk, deer, and reindeer, along with valuable fur-bearing animals that fed into long-established trade networks. Along the coast, the sea offered even greater wealth. Whales, seals, cod, and walrus were plentiful, providing food, materials, and trade goods that sustained communities and encouraged exploration. The geography of Norway did more than provide resources. It shaped how people moved and lived. Travel over land was slow and difficult, so the sea became the natural highway. From an early stage, Norse communities relied on boats to connect distant settlements. Over time, this constant interaction with the sea encouraged innovation. With vast supplies of timber available, shipbuilders experimented and improved their designs. Sails became more widely used, and hull construction evolved into a flexible, overlapping plank system that made ships both strong and light. These vessels were designed for versatility. They could cross open seas, navigate narrow fjords, and move upriver with surprising ease. By the early 9th century, Scandinavian ships had surpassed those of neighbouring regions in both design and performance. Some were capable of carrying dozens of warriors, and powerful leaders could gather fleets numbering in the hundreds. These ships were not only tools of war, but symbols of status and ambition. At the same time, the Norse world was deeply shaped by its beliefs. During this period, Scandinavian society remained pagan, guided by a complex system of gods, myths, and rituals. Among these gods, Odin stood at the centre for warriors and leaders. Known for his wisdom and connection to war, he was believed to observe the world through his ravens and travel between realms on his legendary horse. Yet Odin was not the only figure of importance. Thor, associated with strength and protection, was widely revered across Scandinavian communities. His hammer became a powerful symbol, often worn as an amulet. Religious practices were closely tied to daily life and warfare, and traces of these traditions could even be found in Viking settlements abroad, where sacred places and objects retained their importance for generations. Symbols carried meaning not only in belief, but also in battle. Viking armies were known to carry banners marked with the image of a raven, a creature associated with fate and the gods. These banners were believed to reflect the outcome of battle, appearing animated in moments of victory and subdued in defeat. Stories from later traditions describe them as powerful, almost supernatural objects, often linked to prophecy and sacrifice. In some accounts, the banner itself brought victory to the army, but death to the one who carried it. Whether taken literally or not, such stories reveal how closely warfare and belief were connected in the Viking mindset. The rise of Viking expansion cannot be explained by a single cause. Long before the famous raids began, Scandinavian leaders had already demonstrated the ability to organize large military forces and move them across great distances. Evidence from earlier centuries shows that sizable armies, equipped with advanced weapons and tools, were capable of coordinated campaigns far from their homelands. By the early 9th century, Norway itself was still divided among many small rulers. Local kings and powerful nobles competed for influence, and the political landscape was constantly shifting. Over time, stronger leaders began to consolidate power, pushing rivals aside and reshaping the structure of society. This process likely drove some warriors and chieftains to seek opportunities beyond their homeland. Yet the desire for expansion was not driven solely by conflict at home. Reputation and wealth played a crucial role. In Norse culture, honour was one of the highest values a person could achieve. A lasting name, remembered long after death, was seen as the greatest reward. Raiding and exploration offered a direct path to both fame and riches. At the same time, wider economic changes were creating new opportunities. The growth of major trade centres far beyond Scandinavia increased the demand for goods, such as furs and slaves. In return, vast amounts of silver flowed back into the northern world, fueling further expansion and ambition. As Viking groups began to travel westward, their origins could often be traced to specific coastal regions of Norway. Archaeological finds suggest that many early raiders came from areas facing the open sea, where seafaring traditions were strongest. Fleets were likely formed by combining the forces of local leaders, creating temporary alliances that allowed for larger and more effective expeditions. This cooperation made long-distance raids possible and helped maintain morale among warriors who shared common goals. In battle, Viking warriors held a clear advantage over many of their opponents. Their weapons were both effective and carefully crafted. Swords were long, double-edged, and designed for both strength and balance. Many were decorated with great care and even given names, reflecting their importance to their owners. Spears remained widely used, but Vikings also brought new weapons into combat, including heavy axes that could break through defences with devastating force. Bows and arrows added another dimension to their tactics, allowing them to strike from a distance. Their defensive equipment further strengthened their position. Helmets and mail shirts provided protection that was often lacking among their enemies. Although not every warrior was fully equipped, those who were could dominate the battlefield. Large round shields offered additional defence, often painted in bright colours and reinforced with metal centres. In some regions, unique variations of these shields appeared, adapted to local conditions and styles of fighting. Viking forces usually reached a battlefield by sea or by riding across land, but once the fighting began, they fought on foot. Their most familiar tactic was the shield wall, a tight defensive line that could absorb pressure and strike back with discipline. In some battles, important leaders were protected inside a more compact defensive ring of shields. A formation meant to keep commanders safe while the struggle unfolded around them. Viking commanders also showed a strong sense of battlefield planning. They often divided their troops into separate groups, keeping one unit out of sight behind uneven ground, woodland, or some other natural cover. At the right moment, this hidden force would suddenly appear and strike from the side or rear. Across many battles in the North Atlantic world, this method helped turn confusion into victory. Viking warriors were brave, aggressive, and highly trained, but they were not unbeatable. In Ireland especially, native forces won many of the most important engagements against them. In the earlier fighting, the raiding groups mentioned in Irish records were often not enormous armies, but bands of perhaps a little over 100 men, sometimes a few hundred at most. That said, larger expeditions certainly arrived later. Fleets led by major Viking rulers must have carried far greater numbers. When a ruler could bring hundreds of ships into a harbour, the number of men involved could rise into the thousands. The first Viking attacks on Ireland, Scotland, and Anglo-Saxon England came in the closing years of the 8th century. Early reports from England described the arrival of 3 northern ships on the southern coast, where local officials failed to understand who these strangers were until it was too late. Soon after, one of the most famous early attacks fell on Lindisfarne, a monastery on the northeastern coast of England. That raid became one of the best-known turning points of the age, not only for the destruction itself, but for the fear it spread across the Christian world. A year later, there are signs of violence spreading across the islands to the north and west of Britain. By the middle of the 790s, Ireland too had entered the path of the raiders. One of the earliest recorded attacks struck an offshore island monastery. Whether that first target lay off the northeastern coast of Ulster or near the eastern seaboard, further south remains uncertain, but the meaning is clear enough. The raiders had entered Irish waters. To do that, they first had to move through the island chains north and west of Scotland, and they appear to have done so with little resistance. From there, the next logical step was not simply raiding, but securing bases that could support larger fleets and more permanent activity. One of the first great religious centres to stand directly in their path was Iona. Set on a small island off the western coast of Scotland, it was one of the most prestigious monasteries in the Irish and Scottish world. Its position made it exposed, and the Vikings struck it hard. The first major assault came early in the 9th century, when the monastery was burned. Not long after, the attackers returned and killed a large number of the community. At that point, the leaders of Iona began to look for survival elsewhere. A new monastic centre was established inland in Ireland, at Kells, where the displaced community could continue its life in greater safety. The building of that new foundation became one of the most important responses to Viking violence in the region. Although Iona was not completely abandoned, it never fully recovered its earlier standing. Its destruction must have been a cultural and psychological shock of enormous scale. A place that had once been central to learning, religion, and manuscript production was left weakened, and the intellectual loss may have been as serious as the physical one. At some point during the same broad period, Norwegian settlers also took control of the Scottish Islands and began to establish themselves there in large numbers. Exactly how this conquest unfolded is still unclear. What happened to the earlier inhabitants is even harder to determine. In the far north, the Pictish population of Orkney and Shetland was overwhelmed by Norse settlement. Some may have fled, some may have been killed, and some may have survived only in isolated pockets. But the overall cultural transformation was so complete that old local place names almost entirely disappeared. The sailing distance from western Norway to these northern islands was short enough to make them ideal stepping stones. They became forward bases from which larger expeditions could move southward, and perhaps also shelters for seasonal raiders returning from campaigns. Over time, the Norse presence became permanent and dominant. Scandinavian rule also reshaped neighbouring coastal regions, leaving its mark in names that survived for centuries. Further west and south, the Hebrides were also drawn into this expanding Norse world. Settlement there was strong, though the process appears more complex than in Orkney and Shetland. Many of these islands were not ideal farming country, but certain coastal plains with fertile shell sand soil proved attractive to settlers. Important Norse communities grew up in these areas, and archaeology has revealed new, rectangular buildings placed over earlier local structures. In at least one case, signs of a small fortification suggest an early period of tension and violence between settlers and the existing population. Elsewhere, evidence points to shore bases that may have served as repair points or supply stations for fleets moving toward Ireland. The larger pattern suggests that the Hebrides became an operational zone linking Norway, the Scottish Islands, and the Irish Sea. Control of these islands mattered because they offered not only farmland and shelter, but also strategic depth. With secure bases in the Hebrides, Viking groups no longer needed to build large new urban centres everywhere they went. Some islands may have served as quiet but powerful staging grounds for operations in Ireland and beyond. Tradition later attached several famous names to the conquest and settlement of these islands. One of the most important was a Norwegian chieftain remembered as Ketil Flatnose. In later stories, he appears as a major figure in the Norse westward expansion, though the details vary from one account to another. Some portray him as a man driven out by the growing authority of kings in Norway. Others present him as a commander, first sent to conquer territory on behalf of a ruler, only to break away and create an independent sphere of power. He is also linked in tradition with powerful Viking families operating in Dublin and in the Western Seas. Whether every detail of these stories is reliable is less important than what they reveal. The settlement of the Scottish Islands was not an isolated event, but part of a larger Norse network stretching across the North Atlantic. While these developments were taking shape in the islands to the north and west, major changes were also beginning in Ireland itself. In the middle of the 9th century, large fleets arrived in Irish waters under powerful Viking leaders, who aimed to impose order over earlier Scandinavian groups already active there. This did not produce stability at first. Instead, rival Viking factions clashed with one another along the eastern coast. New fleets attacked older bases and violent struggles broke out between competing groups of raiders. One side gained victory after a brutal naval battle that lasted for days. Out of this unstable situation emerged stronger rulers who would dominate the Scandinavian settlements in Ireland. Among them was Olaf the White, who arrived in Dublin in the early 850s, and appears to have restored control after a period of confusion and rivalry. Long before that moment, however, the north of Ireland had already become deeply vulnerable. During the 8th century, the lands around the North Channel formed one of the most active and prosperous zones of early Christian culture in the Irish world. Great monasteries such as Bangor, Armagh, and Iona stood at the centre of broad religious networks. Around them lay dependent churches, small monasteries, schools, scriptoria, and workshops. These were not simply places of prayer, they were centres of literacy, manuscript production, craftsmanship, and wealth. Precious metalwork, shrines, relics, and books were concentrated there. Bangor, on the southern shore of Belfast Lough, was one of the most important monasteries in the kingdom of the Ualaid. It held a position of enormous prestige and maintained wide religious influence. The monastery had strong intellectual traditions, a respected school, and connections that extended beyond Ireland. Its treasures, both spiritual and material, made it a natural target. The north of Ireland was filled with similar foundations. Churches and monasteries lined important waterways and major routes across the region. Some stood near river mouths and coastal inlets, while others lay further inland along lakes, valleys, and strategic crossings. Together they formed a dense and wealthy ecclesiastical landscape. But many of these sites, especially the coastal ones, were dangerously exposed. Sudden attack from the sea was always possible. By contrast, Armagh enjoyed advantages that helped it endure. Its location inland offered a degree of safety, and in the early 9th century it also gained powerful protection from secular rulers. Those conditions mattered. In the long run, Armagh would outlast many of the great monastic centres that had once rivaled it in influence. The earliest Viking attack on Ireland may have fallen on Rathlin Island, though absolute certainty is impossible. Geography makes it a strong candidate. It was well known as a stopping point for sailors moving between Scotland and Ireland, and local knowledge from there could help a fleet navigate the surrounding waters. The seas nearby also contained dangerous tidal conditions, including a notorious whirlpool that would have mattered greatly to unfamiliar crews. Over the next years, the raiders struck more island monasteries around the Irish coast. One offshore monastery in the northwest was burned. Not every expedition ended in Viking success, and some small raiding groups were defeated by local kings. But the pattern of danger was unmistakable. Even before the biggest attacks came, signs of fear and disruption were appearing. Senior churchmen moved precious relics to safer regions, and some abbots went into exile. Important communities clearly believed that the old security of the coast could no longer be trusted. Then came the major blow. In the early 820s, Vikings attacked Bangor. They returned soon after and struck it again with terrible force. The monastery was plundered and its sacred buildings damaged, and the relics of its founder were torn from their shrine by men searching for valuables. Later tradition remembered the destruction as catastrophic, with large numbers of people killed in a single day. Whether every number preserved in memory is exact or not, the scale of the trauma is beyond doubt. For the people of the north of Ireland, this was more than a raid. It was the violation of one of their greatest sacred centres. After the attack, Bangor did not vanish completely, but its importance declined sharply. The record of activity around it becomes much thinner, and the impression is of a house that survived only as a shadow of what it had been. The damage did not stop there. The following year, other major monasteries in the kingdom of the Aileach were also attacked and burned. Downpatrick and Movila both suffered, and nearby foundations likely endured the same fate. In the years that followed, these places largely faded from the historical record. Some later reappear, but only after long silence. Others never recover their earlier prominence at all. Eventually, local forces of the Aileach managed to drive off one of the raiding groups after a clash in the countryside, but the victory came too late to undo the destruction. By the middle of the 820s, the ecclesiastical network of eastern Ulster had been badly damaged. The effect was not temporary. It would leave marks that lasted for decades, weakening monasteries, disrupting learning, and changing the balance of power in the north of Ireland for generations. After devastating the coastal monasteries, Viking attention shifted toward Armagh, the last major religious centre in the northern region that still stood intact. Unlike Bangor or Iona, Armagh lay inland, positioned away from immediate coastal danger, though still within reach of raiders moving along rivers and lakes. By this time, it had come under the protection of a powerful high king, and its leaders were aware that an attack was likely. Preparations were made, defences organised, and resistance expected. Yet none of this proved enough. In the early 9th century, Viking forces confronted the defenders of Armagh in open battle and defeated them. The loss was severe. Many were taken captive, suggesting that the monastery maintained its own armed force, though it was no match for seasoned Viking warriors. The following year brought even greater devastation. The attackers returned again and again, striking the settlement repeatedly within a single month. Such persistence reveals not only the determination of the raiders, but also the immense wealth concentrated within Armagh. It was not a single target, but a thriving religious town filled with people, treasures, and resources worth seizing. The raids did not stop at the main site. Surrounding churches and smaller religious centres were also plundered, extending the destruction across the wider landscape. These attacks were likely carried out by mounted raiders, moving quickly inland from coastal bases, striking before local forces could gather to respond. At the same time, Viking groups were expanding their reach into other parts of Northern Ireland. A force established itself along the River Foyle, taking advantage of a naturally defensible position. Yet here they encountered stronger resistance. The High King led a well-organised war band against them and drove them out, demonstrating that when properly mobilised, Irish forces could still defeat Viking incursions. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. In some regions, Viking encampments ended violently, leaving behind evidence of brutal conflict. The struggle between raiders and defenders was becoming more intense, more widespread, and more unpredictable. By the mid-830s, Viking activity across Ireland had reached a new level. Entire provinces were subjected to large-scale devastation. Fleets appeared not just along the coast, but deep within river systems, carrying warriors far inland. Two major fleets operated simultaneously along key waterways in the east, plundering settlements, fortifications, and religious sites. The scale of these operations suggests a level of coordination and manpower far beyond earlier raids. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Norse might overwhelm the island entirely. Whether that was their intention remains uncertain, but the threat was real enough to alarm even the most powerful rulers. One of the most important developments during this period was the construction of fortified Viking bases. A fleet entered Lough Neagh and began raiding the surrounding territories, targeting both settlements and churches. Soon after, a fortified camp was established nearby. This marked a turning point. The Vikings were no longer simply raiders, striking and leaving. They were beginning to establish permanent footholds, places where ships could be secured, loot stored, and operations organized. From such bases, further raids could be launched with greater efficiency. The construction of a major fortified site along the coast in the early 840s demonstrated how effective this strategy could be. Built on a naturally defensible stretch of land, closure was large, well-planned, and difficult to assault. It provided secure access for ships and protection for those inside. Its location, near the borders of several Irish kingdoms, made coordinated resistance difficult. No single ruler could easily organize a unified response, and this fragmentation worked in favor of the Vikings. The nearby monastery that had once stood as a center of learning and religion was destroyed, its leader killed during the violence. After this event, it disappears entirely from the historical record. Elsewhere, Viking fleets established similar bases along key rivers, including one that would grow into the most important Scandinavian settlement in Ireland. These strongholds became centres of power, trade, and control, linking the Irish coast to a wider network across the North Atlantic. From these positions, the Vikings could launch deeper and more sustained campaigns, shifting from seasonal raiding toward longer-term presence. Armagh, despite its inland position, continued to suffer. Its buildings were burned again, and its sacred spaces were not spared. In one of the most striking events of the period, its leading religious figure was captured along with valuable relics and taken far from the region. Only through ransom was he eventually returned, bringing with him the treasures that had been seized. These episodes show how even the most important religious centres were vulnerable. Wealth and prestige made them targets, and distance from the sea offered only limited protection. During these years, the High King struggled to contain the threat. His victories were real, especially in certain regions where Viking forces were defeated in open battle. Yet the nature of Viking warfare made defense extremely difficult. Raids were fast, unpredictable, and often launched from multiple directions at once. Even a powerful ruler could not always respond in time. The death of this king in an accident removed one of the strongest figures opposing the Viking advance, creating a moment of uncertainty. In the years that followed, a new leader rose to prominence. He proved to be both a skilled warrior and a capable politician, strengthening his position through alliances and strategic marriages. His rise marked a shift in how the Irish leadership dealt with the Viking presence. Rather than relying solely on military resistance, he combined diplomacy and warfare, even forming alliances with certain Viking leaders when it suited his goals. The Viking threat, however, remained constant. Coastal settlements and inland territories alike continued to face attack. In one campaign, this rising king defeated a group of Norse-associated warriors deep within the mountains, inflicting heavy losses. These enemies were not purely foreign, they included local elements who had adopted Viking ways and fought alongside them. The conflict was no longer simply between Irish and Norse. It had become more complex, involving shifting identities and alliances. To strengthen his position further, this leader entered into a political alliance with a powerful Viking ruler based in Dublin. The agreement was reinforced through marriage, linking the two sides at the highest level. Such alliances were practical and strategic, reflecting a recognition that cooperation could be as valuable as conflict. Yet these relationships were never permanent. When circumstances changed, former allies could quickly become enemies. Tensions with rival Irish kings added another layer to the situation. Power struggles within Ireland itself often intersected with the Viking presence. Leaders had to balance threats from outside with competition at home. Campaigns were launched not only against Viking forces but also against rival dynasties, each seeking control of key territories and important religious centres. Eventually, the new High King turned against his Viking allies. Once in power, he saw them not as partners, but as a danger that needed to be contained. This shift led to one of the most significant campaigns of the century. In the mid-860s, he launched a coordinated assault against Viking strongholds along the northern coast. The attack was devastating. Fortified camps were overrun, livestock and wealth seized, and many Viking warriors killed. Some settlements were destroyed, others abandoned. The operation appears to have cleared large parts of the coastline of Viking control. The surviving Viking groups did not accept this defeat quietly. They regrouped and launched a counterattack, sailing into the river systems that led to the heart of the king's territory. There, they met a fully assembled Irish force. The battle that followed ended in a decisive victory for the defenders. A large portion of the Viking force was killed, and only a few managed to escape. This victory reinforced the High King's reputation and marked a turning point in the struggle for the north. Despite this success, the Viking presence was not entirely eliminated. Some settlements survived further south, and others may have been reoccupied later. Still, the destruction of key coastal bases had long-term consequences. Without a strong network of settlements in the north, large urban centres similar to those in other parts of Ireland never developed there. In the long run, this would shape the economic and political landscape of the region. The conflict continued into the later years of the century. The High King achieved further victories, including a major battle against a coalition of Irish forces supported by Viking warriors. Despite being outnumbered, his army prevailed. His leadership in battle became the subject of later tradition, remembered as calm, confident, and inspiring. At the same time, shifting alliances continued to define the era. Former enemies became allies, and former allies turned into threats. One notable figure, known for his success against Viking forces, was driven from his homeland and later welcomed by the High King, strengthening ties through marriage. Such relationships highlight the fluid and pragmatic nature of power during this period. The Viking ruler of Dublin, however, remained a formidable opponent. In the late 860s, he launched a major raid against Armagh, once again bringing destruction to the already battered centre. A large number of people were killed or taken captive, underlining both the scale of the settlement and its continued vulnerability. The raid demonstrated that even after significant victories, the Viking threat could not be fully contained. Soon after, this same Viking leader turned his attention beyond Ireland, leading a major expedition against a powerful fortress in Britain. After a long siege, the stronghold fell, and he returned with a vast number of captives. These campaigns reveal the broader scope of Viking activity, extending far beyond a single region. The final years of Eard Findliath's rule passed without the same level of drama that had marked the height of his struggle with the Vikings. Yet the northern coast was far from quiet. In 871, the Senil Neogan, fighting alongside a group of Viking allies, seized the stronghold of Dunseverick on the Antrim coast. That event is important because it shows that Scandinavian forces had already returned to parts of the shoreline from which they had earlier been driven. A few years later, another Viking band struck Kilmore, a church lying only a short distance east of Armagh. These were not signs of a great new conquest, but they were enough to show that the danger had not disappeared. The northern coast remained exposed, and Armagh still stood within reach of fast-moving raiders. A more revealing sign of changing power came not from the battlefield, but from politics. In 873, the Great Assembly at Tailtiu was not held. This was no ordinary fair. It was one of the most famous public gatherings in Ireland, a place where politics, trade, ceremony, sport, and royal prestige all came together. It belonged to the authority of the High King, and for generations its celebration had marked the proper order of the island. When it failed to take place, and then failed again in later years, it was a public signal that Eadred Findleath's position was being challenged. The King of Meath, Flan Sinna, was already making clear that he intended to inherit the High Kingship once the aging ruler of the North was gone. Preventing the fair was not just an insult. It was a declaration of ambition. Eadred Findleath died in late November of 879 while staying at a monastery in the south of modern County Louth. Even in death, the Viking threat remained close. Churchmen connected to Armagh were captured by raiders, perhaps while travelling to prepare the dead king's body for burial. That small but telling incident showed how fragile security in the region could be when a powerful ruler disappeared. Eadred was eventually buried at Armagh, the church with which his dynasty had been so closely linked. By then, his reputation was firmly made. He had defeated Viking forces in the west of Sinel Neogain, crushed them again in the mid-8610s, and driven Scandinavian settlers from much of the Antrim coast. He had also defeated major Irish rivals in the south and east. Just as importantly, he had shown political skill equal to his military ability. Faced with strong enemies, he had formed alliances when needed, abandoned them when they no longer served him, and manoeuvred between Irish kings and Viking rulers with great calculation. During the 9th century, no other king of Sinel Neogain matched him as a warrior, and few handled power more effectively. After his death, the Sinel Neogain passed into a quieter phase. For more than 30 years, the dynasty no longer dominated Irish politics in the way it had under Eadred. Rule in Aileach fell to another branch of the family, descended from his uncle Mael Duin. That line provided a succession of local rulers who were clearly capable within their own territory. But none of them projected power across the whole island in the same way. One of the strongest among them was Murchad, son of Mael Duin. He never became king, but he was formidable enough to destroy a fleet of Viking ships on Lough Neagh, after they had ravaged one of the islands there. According to later tradition, every man in the raiding force was cut down despite being fully armed. If that account preserves the memory of a real engagement, then it suggests that Viking activity on Lough Neagh remained a serious problem deep into the closing years of the 9th century. Other records from this period also point to renewed Viking movement in the north. Valuable relics associated with St. Patrick were seized in the region around Lough Neagh. Viking fleets appeared again in local waters. At the same time, leadership in Aileach passed from one branch of the family to the next. Flaithbertach became king, and during his reign, Eadred Findleath's son, Domnall de Baile, began to emerge as an important figure. For a time, he appears to have shared power in Sinel Neogain. It is not entirely clear why he had remained in the background for so long, though local political balances within the dynasty may explain it. By the 890s, however, he was clearly prominent enough to be involved in the kingship itself. It was during these years that Armagh once again became a target. A Viking force associated with Lough Foyle plundered the monastery, and not long afterward a major raid carried off hundreds of captives. This may have been one attack remembered in different ways, or two separate assaults close together. Either way, the message is unmistakable. Armagh remained rich, important, and vulnerable. The Scandinavian groups operating in the north may have been linked to Dublin, and that connection would have made them more dangerous. There is also a later record of a raid against the royal fort of Aileach itself, suggesting that the Vikings of the north were bold enough to strike not just churches, but the symbolic heart of Senel Neogain power. Some of this violence has left traces in archaeology. A Viking sword, likely once buried with a warrior, has been found south of the River Blackwater. In the same broader region, a large deposit of broken ecclesiastical metalwork has been recovered from the river itself. These were not simple objects of daily use. They were fine religious pieces, probably plundered from Armagh and other nearby churches, then broken apart for transport, reuse, or melting down. Alongside them were Scandinavian silver arm rings, ingots and gold finger rings, the kind of material that belonged to a raiding and trading world built on bullion. One especially striking object was a lead weight set with a coin of Alfred the Great, King of Wessex. A reminder that Viking activity in Ireland was tied into a much wider northern network. Weapons found in other parts of Tyrone and along the Blackwater may preserve the memory of direct clashes between Viking raiders and the warriors of Senel Neogain during these troubled decades. Yet while the north still saw scattered violence, the broader Viking world in Ireland was going through a temporary lull. The departure of Olaf the White in the early 870s was followed by a long slowdown in major Scandinavian activity. Later, Irish tradition remembered this as a period of rest lasting about 40 years. The island was not entirely free of Viking danger, but compared with the destruction of earlier decades, the pressure eased. This gave Irish kingdoms time to recover. Monasteries could rebuild, dynasties could reassert themselves, and the political map of Ireland began to stabilise. That recovery reached a dramatic moment in 902, when the Kings of Leinster and Brega combined their forces and drove the Viking elite out of Dublin. The Scandinavian ruling class was expelled. Many ships were abandoned, and the survivors fled badly wounded. Whether every Scandinavian inhabitant was removed is doubtful, but the leadership certainly was. The blow was severe enough to scatter Viking refugees across the Irish Sea world, from northwestern England to the Western Isles of Scotland. Even so, the expulsion from Dublin did not mean the end of the story. Some of those displaced groups began operating from the Hebrides and other bases, and from there they resumed attacks on the north of Ireland. At the same time, a new political figure was rising in Aileach. In 905, Niall Glundub, one of Ard Findliath's younger sons, began to move into the foreground. His rise was not smooth. Tensions with his older half-brother, Domnall Dabéile, nearly led to battle, but the leading men of Senel Neogain stepped in to prevent open conflict. That detail says much about the dynasty at this moment. Despite internal competition, there was still a strong desire to preserve unity and avoid bloodshed within the ruling house. By the second decade of the 10th century, Domnall withdrew from active rule, and Niall took the kingship of Aileach. Before that transition was complete, Niall had already begun to show military energy. He campaigned in Connaught and won a significant victory there, making it clear that he intended to build a reputation beyond his own homeland. He also had larger ambitions. The ageing High King of Ireland, Flann Sinna, was nearing the end of his life, and Niall clearly expected to contest the succession. That would have been challenge enough in ordinary times, but Ireland was about to face something far more dangerous than a dynastic struggle. A new Viking return began in the second decade of the 10th century. A large fleet arrived in the southeast, landing at Waterford. More ships followed, and soon the clergy and laity of Munster were being plundered. Raiding spread into Leinster as well. Then came the leaders who mattered most, the grandsons of Ivar. These men belonged to the same aristocratic Scandinavian world that had once ruled Dublin before the expulsion of 902. They had likely spent years rebuilding their strength across the Viking diaspora, gathering support, men, and silver for a return. When they came back, they did so not as scattered raiders, but as commanders of serious armies. One tradition connects this resurgence with the immense silver hoard found in Lancashire, suggesting that such treasure may once have formed part of a war chest intended for the reconquest of Dublin. Whether that connection is exact or not, the scale of the new invasion is beyond doubt. These were not opportunistic pirates. They were leaders attempting to restore power on a grand scale. Niall understood that the island was entering a dangerous phase. In 914 he concluded an important agreement with the King of the Aileach, sealing an alliance between the central and eastern parts of Ulster. That pact would remain important throughout his brief period at the top of Irish politics. Around the same time, Niall also began intervening heavily in the affairs of Meath, preparing the ground for his own accession to the high kingship. He marched into the region with the armies of the north, camped there in force, and tried to impose order among the sons of the aging High King. He was already acting like the man who expected to inherit Ireland's highest office. When Flann Sinna died in 916, Niall succeeded him and held the great fair at Tailtew in celebration, reversing the political insult once used against his father. But almost immediately he was forced to confront the renewed Viking threat in the south. In 917 the grandsons of Ivar established themselves in Munster and Leinster. Niall responded quickly, gathering the armies of both the northern and southern Uí Néill, and marching south to meet them. He camped cautiously, aware that these enemies were far more dangerous than ordinary raiders. Fighting began and went on for hours. The Vikings suffered losses, but so did the Irish. Then reinforcements arrived for the Scandinavian side, and disaster nearly struck. Niall himself had to intervene with only a small force to prevent a complete collapse. That moment must have shown him just how serious this new invasion was. He remained in the field for weeks, watching and waiting, unwilling to move rashly against such formidable opponents. One of his allies, the King of Leinster, was instructed to apply pressure from another direction. But on the march south, the Leinster army ran into a Viking force in a narrow and dangerous approach. The result was catastrophic. The Leinster men were cut apart, their king killed, along with other rulers and noblemen of the province. It was one of the great disasters of the campaign. The Viking victory opened the road north, and soon Dublin was reoccupied without resistance. What had seemed briefly recoverable after the expulsion of 902 was now lost again. Niall had to retreat. The Vikings were back in force, and the political balance of Ireland had shifted once more. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the Scandinavian position in Ireland was weakened by its own wider ambitions. Large parts of their strength were drawn away to campaigns in Scotland and northern England. One of the leading Viking rulers left Ireland and fought a major battle in Britain, then went on to seize York and establish a power there. That move changed the course of history on both sides of the Irish Sea. But it also reduced the pressure in Ireland at a crucial moment. The constant temptation of richer lands elsewhere repeatedly drew Viking leaders away just when they seemed closest to major conquest in Ireland. For Niall Glundub, that offered at least a narrow opening. The struggle with the renewed Viking presence was far from over, but the division of their forces gave the Irish High King a chance to keep resisting an enemy that might otherwise have overwhelmed the island. In 919, Niall once again gathered the combined strength of the northern and southern Uí Néill and marched on Dublin, where Sihtric had recently secured control of the fortress and town. Dublin stood on the south bank of the River Liffey, in a politically sensitive border zone between Leinster and Brega. That location gave it protection as well as opportunity. The earlier alliance that had driven the Viking elite out of Dublin in 900 and too had been unusual because Leinster rulers and the southern Uí Néill rarely found it easy to cooperate for long. More often, distrust and rivalry kept them apart. That weakness worked in the Vikings' favour. Dublin's nearest Irish neighbours increasingly dealt with the Norse through trade rather than constant warfare, and from that gradual shift, the town began to grow into the powerful Hiberno-Norse centre that would dominate the later 10th century. Niall brought his army close to the Viking stronghold and seems to have tried to force a crossing of the Liffey at the ford near the old church of Sil Mosamhog. This crossing lay beside the river opposite the area, later known as Island Bridge. The place remained remembered for centuries as a key approach to Dublin. Yet what looked like a bold advance soon turned disastrous. Later tradition claimed that Niall had misjudged the enemy's strength, perhaps not realising that fresh Viking reinforcements had recently arrived. Whatever the reason, the Uí Néill army was badly beaten there on the 14th of September 919 by Sihtric's warriors. One later story says that Niall tried to escape and begged his confessor for a horse, only to be refused by the very man who had urged him into the campaign. The tale is dramatic, but it has the feel of legend rather than firm history. What is certain is that the slaughter was severe. Later verse remembered Niall falling with a small circle of prominent companions. Other records list a shocking number of dead among the northern leadership. The High King himself, the King of the Ulaid, the King of Brega, leading heirs to Tara and to northern dynastic authority, the King of Aileach, and many more nobles besides. The losses were not limited to one region. Men from both the north and the southern Uí Néill fell on that field. The scale of the disaster was so great that the battle nearly stripped Northern Ireland of its leadership in a single day. One English chronicle preserved an unusual detail, saying that Sihtric killed Niall, his brother. This probably did not mean a blood relationship. A more likely explanation is that the two had once been fostered in the same household, a bond that could be remembered in language of brotherhood. If so, it adds a striking layer to the battle, with two men shaped in part by the same world later meeting as mortal enemies. The defeat at Dublin was a blow felt across the whole island. Niall became the first High King of Ireland, known to have been killed by Vikings in battle. The rulers of the Sinel Neogain, the Ulaid, and the Aileach all suffered devastating losses. The southern Uí Néill also paid a heavy price, though one of their most important surviving nobles, Donchad Don, lived to take the high kingship after Niall's death. Niall had only ruled for 3 years, and it is possible that he had come to the high kingship without much experience in command on such a scale. If that was true, it may have shown in the confusion of the campaign against Dublin. Some of the men in his army had questionable loyalties, and that too may have weakened his cause. One local king who had recently dealt with the heathens in a failed effort to protect his own territory, perhaps should never have been trusted within such an important coalition. After the battle, Niall's followers carried his body away and buried him at Kells. Although his reign was short, Niall Glundubh became a powerful figure in later memory. Much of that fame came through his wife, Gormla, daughter of the High King Flann Sinna. She was later remembered as a woman linked to 3 royal marriages, a figure who moved through the highest circles of Irish politics and legend. Whether every marriage later attributed to her truly happened is uncertain. But her union with Niall was clearly central to how later generations imagined this period. Stories and poems gathered around her name, and she became a symbol of royal tragedy, ambition, and loss. In later verse, she laments the deaths of kings brought down by foreigners, though the tone of some lines suggests bitterness and irony rather than pure grief. Tradition even claimed that Niall was killed by a Viking named Amlaib, while another royal death associated with her world, that of Herbal of Leinster, came not in battle but through a bizarre accident involving a frightened horse and a spear. Other legends attached themselves to Gormley in the generations that followed. Some painted her as a fallen queen wandering in poverty, though that is almost certainly invention. A later story gives her a strange and haunting death. It says that many years after Niall's fall, she dreamed of him returning to her chamber, only to rise suddenly in agitation, reach for him as he vanished, and fatally wound herself against the bed. The tale belongs more to the world of tragic romance than sober history, but it shows how deeply Niall and Gormley had entered the emotional imagination of medieval Ireland. The Senel Neogen were fortunate that, after the death of their leading king, another capable figure stood ready to take command. This was Fergal, Niall's nephew, one of the many sons of Domhnall de Baile. He ruled Aileach for the next 19 years and proved an effective local king, even if he never gained the island-wide reputation that Niall had held. Donchad Don of the Clan Sholmine became High King, and although later writers tried to balance the disaster at Dublin by praising later Irish victories over the Vikings, those claims greatly overstate the recovery. The reality was harsher. The war against the Norse continued without pause, and the Battle of 919 had changed the balance of power. Even so, the constant pressure of Irish resistance may have played a part in Sitric's decision to leave Dublin not long afterward and pursue better prospects elsewhere. He went on to take York and died away from Ireland, but his victory at Dublin remained one of the defining moments of Viking power in Ireland. In 921, the Vikings tried to turn that victory into something greater. 2 substantial fleets were sent to raid the lands of the northern Uí Néill. One force, led by Heigolfa, sailed with 32 ships. Another fleet of 20 ships was commanded by the son of Wathmaran, himself connected to a Viking family that had ties by marriage to the royal house of Aileach. On paper, this should have been a catastrophe for the Senel Conai and the Senel Neogain. Yet Fergal used cunning rather than direct force to ruin the invasion. His sister seems to have been married into that Viking family, and the record hints that family links may have shaped events. The fleet of Wathmaran's son sailed not into the richest targets of the north, but toward Sen Magair, a remote and wooded place on the western side of Senel Conaili territory, near what is now Mulroy Bay. It was no obvious prize. The area had a royal site, but it was still deeply isolated. That strange decision makes most sense if promises had been made to them, perhaps supplies, perhaps treasure, perhaps some agreed arrangement that kept them away from the main fighting. Meanwhile, Heigolfa's larger fleet struck Inishowen and ravaged the peninsula. He even built a long fort there, probably at a strong coastal site later known as Dunree. Yet the whole enterprise quickly began to unravel. The behaviour of the Allied fleet, or perhaps their refusal to cooperate fully, seems to have unsettled Heigolfa's men. The Viking force abandoned the new fortification in haste, leaving behind only a small group whose delay was later blamed on laziness. That isolated party, the crew of a single ship, was then destroyed by Fergal. Their vessel was captured and broken, and the surviving raiders were cut down. What had looked like a major Viking offensive collapsed into confusion and retreat. Fergal's relations with the family of Wathmaran remained good after this episode, which strongly suggests that no serious violence was directed against that fleet at Chen Magair. They may simply have been paid off and sent away, yet their arrival may have left a strong mark on local memory. A poem that survives in later forms seems to preserve an echo of those events, though wrapped in legend and romance. It tells of Viking fleets, royal marriages, treasure, betrayal, and a massacre at Senmager. In the story, daughters of a local king are given in marriage to Vikings in exchange for relief from tribute. One of these women, named Dweeblin, escapes from her Viking husband, steals treasure, and returns to an Irish noble she prefers as the father of her children. The insult leads to Viking demands for compensation, and the Irish respond by wiping out the entire fleet. The numbers in the poem are far too large, and much of the tale clearly belongs to the world of literary invention. Yet buried inside it are names, places, and fragments of political memory that point back to the early 10th century. It preserves distorted truth inside a dramatic shell. Archaeology adds another layer to this story. Several Viking Age silver hoards have been found in Donegal and Inishowen, and some scholars have connected them with these failed northern expeditions. A silver hoard discovered near Rafo in the early 20th century contained arm rings and ingots of a type that suggest burial in the early 10th century, perhaps around 930. Other finds from Inishowen itself include groups of silver arm rings buried near old routes and coastal strongholds. Their forms link them closely to the Hiberno-Norse world, and taken together they suggest a period of intense Viking presence, movement, and insecurity across the region. Whether they were hidden during the raids of 921 or during later disturbances cannot be proved with certainty, but they fit the atmosphere of conflict very well. The silver seems to come from a time when warriors moved quickly, fortunes shifted suddenly, and men hid wealth in the ground with the hope of returning for it later. The same year also saw a major Viking assault on Armagh, led by Gothfrith, grandson of Ivar and King of Dublin. The raid took place just before the Feast of St. Martin, at a time when the great monastery would have been crowded. The attackers behaved with a cold practicality. They spared the prayer houses and many of the holy men, as well as the monastery itself, except for a few buildings burned through carelessness. This was not mercy, it was calculation. A monastery that survived could be plundered again, and its surrounding population could continue to supply captives in future raids. Gothfrith's men ravaged the countryside widely, pushing eastward and westward. But when one raiding party crossed into the eastern lands of the Sinel Neogan, they encountered a rising young warrior named Muirchertach, son of Neil Glundub. This is the first clear appearance of Muirchertach in the record, and it is a striking one. He fell upon the raiders and defeated them so sharply that only a handful escaped in the fading light. The rest were left dead behind them. Later generations would know him as Muirchertach of the Leather Cloaks, one of the most formidable warriors the Senel Neogan ever produced. Stories later tried to explain his epithet with dramatic tales involving disguises in cowhides and revenge against old enemies. But those legends belong more to saga than to history. A simpler explanation is far more likely. The name probably came from a distinctive form of leather protection associated with him, or with his elite troops. Whatever the origin of the title, his reputation began here in the years after his father's death, when the north of Ireland desperately needed strong leadership. Unlike Niall, whose rise to real prominence had been slow, Muirchertach emerged quickly. Even while his cousin Fergal held the kingship of Aileach and controlled much of the local political structure, Muirchertach was able to pursue much wider ambitions. He seems to have been recognised as the Sinel Neogain, candidate for the future High Kingship, and his career from this point onward shows a man acting on a national stage. He became the great enemy of the Vikings in the north. To sustain that role, he must have built and maintained a substantial warband, and it is even possible that some Scandinavians served within it. The that possibility is not as strange as it sounds. In this period, Scandinavian communities in some places coexisted with Irish rulers, traded with them, and sometimes fought alongside them. The frontier between enemy and ally was never simple. The threat remained constant. Vikings operating from Carlingford raided churches in Armagh territory. Others based around Strangford Lough killed local rulers and harried the coast. In 924, a great new fleet was destroyed in the tidal waters of Dundrum Bay, where hundreds drowned in a catastrophe remembered for its sheer scale. Yet the sea continued to bring more raiders. In 926, Vikings sacked Dun Severick on the Antrim coast, killing and capturing many, most likely for the slave trade. That same year, Muirchertach struck back with force. He attacked the Vikings of Carlingford and routed them so completely that 200 were beheaded. It may have been this defeat that ended their presence there, because after that they disappeared from the records of the area. The struggle continued immediately. After the fall of Carlingford, Vikings from Strangford moved south to Anagasson under the command of Halfdan, son of Gothfrith of Dublin. Muirchertach met them near a bridge at Cluain na Cruntha in late December 926 and inflicted another heavy defeat. Halfdan himself was killed, along with half his force. The survivors fell back and were trapped for a week at a ford near Newry until the King of Dublin came to relieve them. Even when rescue came, the damage had been done. Soon afterward, the fleet at Anagasson departed, and if the long fort there had not already been crippled, it can hardly have recovered its former strength. Muirchertach had proved that Northern Ireland could still produce a war leader capable of breaking major Viking forces in the field. Yet even his successes did not end the danger. In 928, a fleet from Limerick sailed into Lough Neagh and plundered the islands and shores of the lake. 2 years later, another Viking force built a long fort there, probably near the mouth of the River Main. By 932, its leader was a powerful jarl named Torolb, clearly a man of standing. Muirchertach, in alliance with the Dal Nareid, killed him in battle. A poem suggests that Muirchertach even commanded his own fleet on Lough Neagh during this campaign, an impressive sign of military organisation and local adaptation. But even then, the Viking ships on the lake were not entirely wiped out. They endured and the pressure remained. In 933, Muirchertach's only known serious quarrel with his cousin Fergal erupted into open conflict. Whatever caused it, the split was dangerous. Fergal called in Viking support, led by his own nephew, a son of Wathmaran, and together they defeated Muirchertach's men, killing around 200. The setback was real, but it did not break him. Later in the same year he crushed the Ulaid in battle, and soon afterward intercepted another major raid that had plundered Armagh and pushed deep into the surrounding country. He overtook the raiders, killed large numbers of them, and recovered the spoil. From that point, Viking attacks on Sinel Neogain territory seem to have eased for a time. When Fergal died in 938, Muirchertach appears to have taken the kingship of Aileach as well. By then, he had moved beyond being merely a regional war leader. He began cooperating with the High King Don Chad Don against Dublin itself. Their relationship had not always been easy, and there had been tension between them in earlier years, but now necessity drew them together. The Viking ruler of Dublin had been raiding aggressively, even striking important church sites, and carrying off large numbers of captives. Faced with that threat, the two Uí Néill leaders joined forces and laid siege to Dublin. They also ravaged Leinster widely, showing that the balance of power had once again begun to shift. Then, in 939, the war came to Muirchertach's own doorstep. Vikings launched a daring raid on Aileach itself, the royal stronghold at the southern base of Inishowen. In the attack, Muirchertach was captured and came close to losing his life, but somehow secured his freedom by paying a ransom. It was a humiliating moment and a dangerous one, and it may explain what happened next. That same year, Muirchertach launched a sea raid against the Scandinavian settlements of the Western Islands. The expedition appears to have struck the Hebrides, perhaps as retaliation against the men who had dared attack his own royal centre. Later, records describe him bringing back plunder from the islands, and a silver and coin hoard buried on Skye around this period may hint at the shock such a raid caused. If that connection is real, then the wealth hidden there came from a world suddenly threatened by an Irish counterattack few had expected. This raid across the sea has even invited comparison with later Scandinavian stories preserved in Iceland, stories about families who had once moved between Dublin, Scotland, and the Western Isles before settling in Iceland. Those tales cannot be treated as straightforward history, but they remind us how deeply connected these regions were. Dublin, the Hebrides, Western Scotland, and even Iceland belong to a broad Norse world tied together by kinship, trade, warfare, and migration. Muirchertach's campaign against the islands shows that Irish kings were not merely reacting to Viking attacks on land. At their strongest, they could answer with organised war at sea, carrying the fight directly into Scandinavian territory. By this point, the recovery of the Senel Neogain from the disaster of 919 was unmistakable. Niall Glundub had died at Dublin in a crushing defeat that seemed to shatter the political order of the north. Yet within 2 decades his son had rebuilt military power, defeated Viking fleets, broken long forts, defended churchlands, challenged Dublin, and even struck overseas. That transformation did not end the Viking presence in Ireland, nor did it bring peace. But it did prove that the balance of power was never fixed. The years after the Battle of Dublin were not simply a story of Norse expansion. They were also the story of a Northern Irish dynasty that refused to collapse, adapted under pressure, and produced in Muirchertach, of the leather cloaks, one of the most relentless opponents the Vikings in Ireland would ever face. The saga tells a remarkable story. Hoskuld was a wealthy Icelandic chieftain, the kind of man who, like many ambitious men of his world, did not remain at home forever. He sailed abroad in search of reputation, experience, and opportunity, travelling through Norway and other Scandinavian lands. During one of these journeys, while attending the Norwegian King's assembly, he purchased a young Irish slave woman. He was told that she could not speak. Hoskuld already had a wife and family in Iceland, yet he took this woman as his concubine and brought her home across the sea. In time, she gave birth to a son, Olaf, a man later remembered in Icelandic tradition as Olaf Peacock, a name that reflected his taste for splendid clothing and high style. For a while, the woman remained an obscure figure in Hoskuld's household, dismissed as silent and unremarkable. But one morning, everything changed. Hoskuld heard voices while he was out near the farm, and when he followed the sound, he found the Irish slave speaking freely to her child. In that instant, her supposed muteness vanished as a lie. She was not speechless at all. She had kept her voice hidden. Once confronted, she revealed not only that she could speak, but that she came from far more than servile origins. She said her name was Melkorka and declared that her father had been a king in Ireland. According to her own account, she had been captured there when she was 15 years old. That claim has always stood at the centre of the story. The name given for her father appears in Norse form, but behind it lies an Irish royal name, Muirchertach. If the tale preserves any real memory, the most convincing figure behind it is Muirchertach, of the leather cloaks, the fierce King of Aileach. No other ruler of that age fits the wider atmosphere of the story so well. He was famous, feared, and deeply entangled in the Viking world that linked Ireland, Britain, and the western seas. A daughter of such a king could easily have been taken during one of the large Viking raids of the early 10th century, perhaps in the violence that followed the assault on Armagh and its surrounding lands. From that moment onward, after learning who she claimed to be, Höskuld is said to have treated her with greater care. Even in slavery, royal blood still carried its own weight. The story takes another turn when Olaf reached manhood. As he grew older, it was Melkorka who urged him to sail abroad and seek out the kin from whom he had been cut off. She wanted her son to reclaim a place in the world of kings and nobles, not live forever as the child of a hidden captive. Before he left, she gave him tokens by which he might be recognised in Ireland. One was a gold arm ring, said to have been given to her by her father when she was still a small child. The others were a knife and a belt, objects that only those close to her early life would understand. Melkorka believed that her old nurse, if still alive, would know these signs at once. They were not just valuables, they were proof of identity, pieces of memory carried across years of separation and slavery. Olaf first made his way to Norway, where he came before the royal court. There, the Queen's mother is said to have helped him, providing him with a ship and a company of men who looked more like warriors than traders. With that support behind him, he sailed west and eventually reached Ireland. There, according to the saga, he came before his grandfather, King Muirchertach. Another Irish noble of the same name could be made to fit the timeline more neatly, and some have preferred that explanation. But the stronger figure in memory remains Muirchertach of the Leather Cloaks. He was one of the great Irish war leaders of the period, well known to Scandinavians active in Ireland and Britain. If the tale was shaped by oral tradition, his name is exactly the kind that would have endured. The timing of the story, despite its uncertainties, is not impossible. If Melkorka was taken as a young teenager during the early Viking attacks in the north and west, and if her son reached Ireland as a young man in the late 930s, the dates fall into a pattern that is at least believable. No saga chronology can be treated as exact. Too many years are compressed, too many details softened by retelling. Time in such narratives rarely moves with complete precision, but the broader outline works better than might be expected. That matters, because it suggests that behind the romance of the story, there may be a distant memory of real connections between Irish royal families and the Norse world of the Western Seas. One detail in the tale is especially striking. Olaf is said to have spoken Irish fluently. When King Muirchertach heard him speak, he immediately recognised not only ability, but breeding. The king is said to have declared that the young man was clearly of noble birth, whether kinsman or not, and that no one spoke Irish better. That reaction is important. In a courtly setting, language was more than communication. It was identity, refinement, and belonging. Once the tokens were shown and Olaf's resemblance to his mother noted, the king accepted him as his grandson and welcomed him into his court. The old nurse who'd once cared for Melkorka was also still alive, and when she learned the truth, she was overjoyed. In the story, she survives long enough to see the hidden line restored. The portrait of Muirchertach that appears in this episode feels unexpectedly close to the historical man. The saga describes him as a ruler who rarely stayed in one place for long because there was always fighting somewhere in the islands to the west. Winters were spent defending his lands from Vikings and other raiders. Olaf and his men served alongside him aboard ship, and in battle they proved hard opponents. The king, impressed by Olaf's courage and skill, began to trust his judgment more and more. This image fits remarkably well with what is known of Muirchertach's career. He was a restless and highly active ruler, always in motion, always answering threats, always pushing into the shifting military landscape of Ireland and the surrounding seas. That same part of the saga opens an intriguing possibility. If Olaf truly reached Ireland and entered Muirchertach's service, then he may have played a part in the king's seaborne expedition against the Hebrides. A young man shaped by the Norse world, bringing with him an armed ship and a seasoned crew, would have been exactly the kind of advantage an Irish ruler needed for such a venture. Muirchertach may have had the ambition, the leadership, and the political reason to strike across the sea. But success on that scale may also have required maritime expertise drawn from the Scandinavian sphere itself. The story cannot prove this. It only invites the thought. Still, it offers a plausible explanation for how an Irish king could suddenly appear in the Western Islands with enough strength to raid effectively and return with wealth and prestige. The saga says that Muirchertach wanted Olaf to remain with him and even offered him the chance to inherit after his death. Olaf refused. Instead, he chose to return to Iceland, carrying rich gifts from his Irish grandfather, including finely made weapons and other treasures that marked his newly recognised status. One thing Muirchertach would not allow was the return of Melkorka's old nurse to Iceland. That refusal, the story says, caused Melkorka real disappointment when her son came home. Yet the voyage had still transformed Olaf. He returned not as the uncertain son of a hidden slave woman, but as a man now celebrated for his journey and for his connection to an Irish royal house. The adventure itself became part of his fame. In 940, Muirchertach again worked alongside the High King Donchad Don. Together they led their forces into Leinster and Munster and took hostages from both regions. By this stage, their relationship seems to have settled into a practical alliance. Donchad was older and already established in the High Kingship, while Muirchertach had become the most formidable military figure of his generation in the north. It is easy to imagine the terms that bound them together. Muirchertach supported the older ruler in the present, and in return the expectation would have been that his own succession to the High Kingship would later be recognised and supported. Such arrangements were never guaranteed, but in a political world built on ambition, negotiation, and strength, they made perfect sense. The following year brought one of the most famous episodes of Muirchertach's career. A bitter winter froze rivers and lakes so hard that men could cross where normally only water stood. Muirchertach seized the moment. Leading his warband through the frozen landscape, he launched a campaign that later tradition remembered as the Expedition in the Frost. His force plundered lands in Mide and Uí Fáilge, then pushed into Osrage, which submitted. From there, he moved into the lands of the Daci, ravaging as he went before continuing south to Cashel. There, he captured Celalchan, king of Munster, and brought him north so that he could submit in person before the High King. It was a dramatic show of mobility and power, one of those moments when the authority of a northern war leader was projected across the whole island. Later tradition surrounded this expedition with literary elaboration, and over time it became tangled with other royal journeys and stories from later centuries. But behind the embellishment stands a simple reality. Muirchertach had the confidence and ability to strike deep into the south, across multiple kingdoms, in the dead of winter, and return with a king as his prisoner. That was not the achievement of a regional chieftain. It was the act of a man already behaving like the future ruler of Ireland. Viking activity in the north did not disappear. In 942, raiders led by a member of the old Dublin royal line plundered the monastery at Downpatrick. Another group of Scandinavians then attacked that raiding party, on an island, perhaps in Strangford Lough, where Norse presence remained strong. The region still held evidence of Scandinavian settlement and contact, with imported objects, coin finds, artistic traces, and even signs of a Norse Christian presence. But the political climate was turning against them. The son of Ragnall was soon killed by the king of the Ualaid, in revenge for the plundering of Patrick's church, and many of the Scandinavians of Strangford appear to have chosen departure over destruction. Those who remained were nearly wiped out the following year by the Dal Fiatash. By then, the long struggle to break Viking power in the north had reached a decisive stage. The old bases at the coast and sea inlets were gone or fading. Only one major stronghold remained in the region, the Viking base on Lough Neagh. It was in 943, just as the northern balance was swinging further against the Vikings, that Muirchertach's run of fortune ended. On February 26th, near Ardee, he met a Viking force led by Blacair, another member of the powerful Norse dynasty connected to Dublin. These raiders were on their way to attack Armagh. Somewhere near Clúine Chain, battle was joined and Muirchertach was killed. His death does not seem to have come from treachery or extraordinary misfortune. It appears instead to have been the end that always waited for a man who lived constantly by war. Perhaps he encountered the raiders without full preparation. Perhaps he had only his close guard with him. Whatever the immediate circumstances, the larger truth was plain. He had spent years cutting down Viking raiders across the north, and at last the same world of violence caught up with him. His enemies went on to plunder Armagh the next day. Yet the memory of Muirchertach outlived the raid that followed his death. He was remembered in the annals with a title of astonishing force, the Hector of the Western world. It was not a casual compliment. It cast him as a champion of heroic stature, a warrior whose fame rose above ordinary kingship. For the Seinol Neogen, he had been more than a ruler. He had been the sword arm of the north, the relentless enemy of Viking expansion, and the most brilliant military figure of his generation. After his fall, the Seinol Neogen once again found themselves fortunate in succession. His son Domnall emerged quickly as the new king of Aileach, and with him a new identity began to take shape. He was among the first Irish rulers to be known by the name Ua Nel, taken from his grandfather Neil Glundub. That choice mattered. It tied him not just to his father's recent fame, but to a wider ancestral line whose memory carried weight throughout the island. The new surname signalled both lineage and ambition. It was a declaration that the family of Niall still stood at the centre of northern power. One of Domnall's first major concerns was the final Viking presence on Lough Neagh. In 945, another hard winter froze the waterways, and he used the weather with the same opportunism his father had shown before him. Accompanied by his brother Flaith Bertach and the warband of the Seinol Neogen, Domnall attacked the Viking long fort at Ruib Menna. The ice trapped the enemy's ships and stripped them of mobility. Domnall's force stormed the base, killed its defenders and destroyed the longships. It was a total victory. With that attack, the Viking presence on Lough Neagh was eliminated for good. The northern campaign that had stretched across generations had finally reached completion. At the same time, the death of Donchard Don had opened a larger struggle over the high kingship. The man who might most naturally have followed him had been Muirchertach of the Leather Cloaks. But his death removed that possibility and created an opening for rival dynasties. Two serious claimants emerged. One was Congalach of Noath, a strong and capable ruler from the southern Uí Nel. The other was Raedri Wa Cananain of the Seinol Conail, a less obvious figure at first, but one who quickly proved dangerous and ambitious. Congalach moved early and dramatically. In 944, allied with the King of Leinster, he attacked Dublin itself, killing large numbers of the Norse defenders, burning the fort and carrying away great wealth. The destruction was severe, and it established him as a ruler bold enough to claim the highest place in Ireland. Domnall Gwy Nael did not immediately challenge him. That restraint was politically intelligent. Domnall was still young and had only recently inherited a kingdom scarred by decades of war. Rather than rush into a contest for the high kingship, he seems to have chosen first to strengthen his rule in Aileach and allow rivals to exhaust themselves. Rhuaidri Ua Cananain, by contrast, opposed Congalach from the start. He not only challenged the High King's authority, but also struck at Senel Nergain lands. More than once his war band raided across the north and into Meath, testing both Domhnall and Congalach alike. In one clash, Scandinavian allies from the Lough Foyle region fought beside the Senel Nergain, showing again that not all Norse groups stood outside Irish political life. Some remained woven into local alliances, especially in the frontier zones. Rhuaidri pushed his luck too far. By 950 he had established a fortified camp in Meath and used it as a base for months of plundering. In the end, that forward position became his grave. Vikings from Dublin struck the camp and killed him, bringing down one of the most serious challenges to the High Kingship. His death removed the most dangerous rival to Congalach, who now stood as the undisputed leading ruler in Ireland. Even so, Congalach had every reason to remain wary of Dublin. Viking kings could be allies one year and deadly enemies the next. He seems to have understood that well enough, because his dealings with the Norse were never careless. At times, he fought beside them. At other moments, he turned on them with full force. In the years that followed, Congalach continued to rule energetically. Yet the Vikings of Dublin remained a constant danger, even when outward relations seemed stable. In 951, they launched a destructive raid into Meath, using Kells as a base and carrying off huge numbers of captives, along with cattle, horses, silver, and gold. The scale of the raid shows how deeply slavery and plunder still shaped the Viking economy of Dublin. Monasteries were not only religious targets, they were wealthy centres surrounded by dependent populations, perfect places for the seizure of both treasure and people. The High King could not ignore such a challenge, and eventually cooperation between Congalach and Domhnall, Ua Nel, began to grow more visible. In 955, Congalach campaigned westward into Connaught, while Domhnall undertook a bold supporting operation of his own. He assembled a fleet at the mouth of the Bann and navigated inland through waterways, lakes, and portages in one of the most impressive logistical movements of the age. His ships passed through Lough Neagh, moved up the Blackwater, crossed into the Erne system, and advanced toward the lands of Breifne. From there, his men plundered the region and forced submission from Ua Ruach. This was not merely raiding for spoil. It was a demonstration that the King of Aileach could project force far beyond the usual limits of the Northern Kingdom. Domhnall was proving himself not only as a defender of the North, but as a strategist with island-wide reach. Then, in 956, Congalach made the mistake that ended his career. During a major provincial assembly in Leinster, word was secretly sent to the Vikings of Dublin. On his return journey, Congalach and his leading nobles were ambushed near the Liffey. They were taken and killed. Once again, a High King of Ireland fell to Viking hands. The deaths shocked the political order, but for Domhnall Ua Nel, they also cleared the path that patience had long preserved. By avoiding reckless confrontation and building strength carefully over time, he had outlasted rivals stronger and more visible than himself. Soon after Congalach's fall, Domhnall was recognised as the new High King of Ireland. When that moment came, Domhnall did not try to hold every office personally. He returned the kingship of Aileach to the Senel Nergain, allowing trusted kinsmen to govern the northern kingdom, while he exercised wider authority across the island. This was a practical arrangement, and an effective one. The Kings of Aileach served as supporters of the High King drawn from their own dynasty, preserving the balance between local strength and central ambition. For much of Domhnall's reign, Those chosen came from the descendants of Domnall Dabail, the powerful branch already prominent in earlier struggles. The system worked well until violence again intervened and fresh succession was required. Yet even then, the dynasty still produced able men. That continuity was one of the real strengths of the Senel Neogain in this period. Domnall himself proved active, flexible, and politically imaginative. One of the clearest signs of that was the marriage of his sister Dunlait to Amlaib Cuaran, King of Dublin. Such a union was not simply personal, it was diplomatic, part of the long effort to manage the dangerous relationship between the northern Uí Néill and the rulers of the Viking town. Bloodshed, rivalry, and revenge lay between those houses, but marriage could serve as a bridge where war alone failed. That alliance may help explain why, in the early 950s, Domnall led a hosting in Brega with the consent of the foreigners. In other words, he was willing to use understanding with Dublin when it served his interests. Like the strongest rulers of his age, he knew that survival and success did not come from fighting every enemy at every moment. They came from knowing when to strike, when to wait, and when to turn yesterday's foe into today's partner. By the middle of the 10th century, the rulers of the northern Uí Néill may have started to understand that driving the Scandinavians out of most of the north had carried a hidden cost. Domnall himself had only destroyed one Viking base on Lough Neagh, but the wider pattern was far more damaging. The destruction of Scandinavian settlements along the Antrim coast, followed by the loss of other Viking strongholds at Carlingford and Strangford Lough, left the Senel Neogain increasingly cut off from the most dynamic parts of Irish economic life. A small Norse presence may still have survived around Lough Foyle, perhaps linked by trade to the Scandinavian world of northern England, but that was not enough to change the larger picture. While the Viking towns of the south grew richer and more connected, the Senel Neogain remained on the margins. They were missing out on overseas trade, access to hired warriors, fleets, imported silver, and the kind of concentrated wealth that urban settlements could generate much more effectively than any collection of dependent rural kingdoms. Facing that growing weakness, Domnall may have tried to solve the problem by shifting the centre of his power toward Meath. At that moment, the ruling dynasty there was in difficulty. Internal quarrels had weakened its authority, and the political disorder may have looked like an opening too valuable to ignore. But it was a dangerous opportunity. Meath was fertile, central, and politically vital, and any attempt by the northern Uí Néill to seize part of it was bound to provoke a fierce response. In the early 960s, Domnall launched a striking operation that revealed both his ambition and his imagination. He assembled a fleet on one river, hauled the vessels overland across different territories, and brought them all the way to Lough Ennell near Mullingar. Once on the lake, his men plundered the islands, including places closely tied to the royal world of Meath. It was a dramatic show of force. Afterward, he seems to have remained active in the area around Kells, suggesting that this was not just a raid, but part of a broader effort to establish influence. In the following years, he campaigned west into Connaught, exacted submission from local rulers, then turned on Leinster and pressed both the Irish of that province and the Scandinavians for months. Later, tradition may preserve an echo of these ambitions. In one account, a king of Meath sought military help from the north at a moment of crisis, only to be told that support would come only if half of Meath and the territory around Tara were effectively handed over as an inherited right. Whether that exact demand belongs to Domnall's own age or reflects later political memory, it captures something essential. The northern Uí Néill were no longer content with the old arrangement. They may have been trying to turn the high kingship into something more direct and territorial, with Meath itself partially absorbed into their power. If that was the plan, it helps explain what happened next. In 970, Domhnall's forces suffered a serious defeat in battle near Tara at the hands of a coalition that included both Irish rivals and the King of Dublin. Important allied kings fell in that clash, including the rulers of Ulaid and Ergiala. Soon afterward, Domhnall was driven out of Meath by the clan Cholmain. He answered with ferocious retaliation, ravaging churches, forts and territories across Meath and neighbouring regions. Some of the violence was appalling, even by the standards of the age. One attack on a monastery ended in the deaths of hundreds of men and women. This was more than a failed campaign. It was a turning point in Irish politics. If Domhnall intended to redraw the balance between north and south by reducing Meath and strengthening the Seanal Neogain, he failed. Worse than that, he seems to have destroyed the trust that had long sustained the alternating high kingship between the northern and southern branches of the Uí Néill. What emerged from this struggle was not a stronger northern kingship, but a broken political relationship. The Seanal Neogain still dominated the north, and the clan Cholmain still dominated the south, but the old cooperation between them was badly damaged, perhaps beyond repair. Domhnall returned to the north, resumed the kingship of Aileach, and continued to hold the high kingship as well. But the larger system had been wounded. Much of the rest of his reign was comparatively quiet, though he suffered a deeply personal loss when his son and intended heir was killed by the King of Dublin. That death shattered the succession plan Domhnall had likely intended, and when he himself died at Armagh in 980, he left behind a mixed legacy. He had been energetic, inventive, and capable of striking campaigns, especially in his use of mobile fleets transported overland. But his attempt to overcome the economic isolation of the north by force had ended in failure and had helped bring the old Uí Néill order closer to collapse. After Domhnall's death, the Seanal Neogain sank into a quieter and less influential phase that lasted for more than 20 years. Rule in Aileach passed to other members of the dynasty, while the southern Uí Néill High King built an impressive record of success. The north was fortunate in one respect. Viking attacks during these years were limited. Small fleets still moved along the coast, and they knew well how to exploit moments of weakness. But the Seanal Neogain avoided the kind of sustained devastation seen in earlier generations. Even so, the danger never disappeared. Raiding struck nearby regions including Dalriata, Iona, Downpatrick, Derry, and sites around Strangford Lough. Captives were carried off, and the pattern was familiar. The Vikings did not need to dominate the north completely to remind everyone that the coast remained vulnerable. The recovery of northern power began not through a battlefield victory, but through church politics. A cleric from Bodenay, a major church in the mountain heartland of Seanal Neogain, played a decisive role in restoring prominence to Domhnall's line. In the early 990s, he made a formal visitation through the kingdom and publicly conferred royal status on Aed, Domhnall's young son, in the presence of the community of St. Patrick. This was no small gesture. It effectively presented Aed as the northern Uí Néill candidate for the high kingship of Ireland. Older local rulers still held power in Aileach and managed the practical business of kingship in the north, but Aed was now being shaped as something larger. By the turn of the millennium, he seems to have been king of Aileach himself. Yet at that same moment, events elsewhere were moving in a direction that would make his ambitions far harder to realise. The rise of Aed coincided with the rise of Brian Boru. During the 990s, Brian transformed himself from a powerful king of Munster into a challenger for control of the whole island. The southern Uí Néill High King was still strong and experienced, and he had brought Dublin firmly under his authority. But by 1001, his resistance to Brian was beginning to weaken. Aed did little to help him. From the perspective of long-term strategy, that was a major failure. The northern Uí Néill had every reason to support the existing order against a revolutionary challenger from Munster. Instead, Aed appears to have watched events unfold without fully grasping their significance. When the southern High King finally stepped aside and Brian took the kingship in 1002, it marked a historic break. For the first time in recorded history, the High Kingship passed to a ruler outside the Uí Néill. Aed did march south to the Great Assembly site in Meath, but he returned north peacefully. He and Brian parted under a temporary truce, and that brief encounter showed just how uncertain the new political landscape had become. Later that same year, Aed had his first real confrontation with Brian. After campaigning in Connaught, he joined forces with the King of Aileach and other northern rulers to block Brian's advance near Dundalk. For a moment, it looked as if the North might stand together against the new High King. But Brian was a determined and subtle opponent. He withdrew, yet the alliance opposing him soon began to crack. Whether by deliberate manipulation or simple mistrust, relations between Aed and his main northern ally collapsed. In 1004, the result was a huge battle fought in eastern Ulster. The defeat of the Uleid was overwhelming. Their king, his sons, his brother, other rulers, and large numbers of nobles were killed. The fighting stretched over a wide area, and even the surviving enemy leaders were hunted down the next day. Yet the victory was spoiled by disaster. Aed himself died in confused circumstances just after the battle. Some claimed he was killed by the defeated enemy during the chaos of retreat. Others insisted that his own side was responsible, though, whether by accident or by darker means, was never made clear. His death inspired poetic mourning, and later memory treated him with respect. He was remembered as a king whose loss darkened the land and brought grief to Tara, to Ireland, and to his own kin. There were calls for Armagh to complete his burial with the honour he deserved. But for all the praise, his career had fallen short of what the Sínal Neogan needed. Aed had ambition, and he clearly wished to be seen as a candidate for the High Kingship, yet he never developed beyond the role of a strong northern ruler. His campaigns remained regional. He did not act decisively when the old Uí Néill order was under threat, and he only opposed Brian when Brian came close enough to threaten his own interests directly. That was not enough. In the end, Aed appears as a respected King of Aileach, who possessed status and aspiration, but not the wider vision or force of character needed to shape the island's destiny. After his death, the kingship passed to his nephew Flaith Bertach, another ambitious and hard-driving ruler. He too would seek greatness, and he too would discover how difficult it had become for a King of Aileach to turn northern strength into command over Ireland as a whole. Almost as soon as Flaith Bertach rose to power, he found himself facing one of the most formidable figures in Irish history, Brian Boru. In 1004, Brian advanced west into Connaught with a clear purpose. His goal was not only conquest, but recognition. He intended to move across the island in a grand display of authority, a ceremonial progress that would force every region to acknowledge him as the dominant ruler of Ireland. To reach the north, however, he had to pass through a narrow and difficult route controlled by the Sínal Neogan. Flaith Bertach understood the terrain better than anyone. He placed his forces at a strategic coastal passage near Ballysadare, where the natural landscape created a defensive bottleneck. Forests and low mountains limited movement, and the path he blocked was the most practical route into the Northern Territories. It was a strong position, one that could be held even against a powerful army. Brian assessed the situation and chose not to force a battle. Instead, he withdrew. The encounter revealed something important. Flaith Bertach was not a passive ruler. He was capable, cautious and willing to stand his ground. Brian returned the following year, and this time the balance shifted. Flaithbertach could not prevent him from reaching Armagh, the most important religious centre in the north. Brian's arrival there was carefully staged. He made a generous offering at the main church and ensured that his presence was recorded in a way that elevated his status beyond that of an ordinary king. The message was unmistakable. He was not simply another regional ruler pressing his claims. He was presenting himself as the supreme authority of the island. Brian's campaign did not stop at Armagh. His forces pushed into the territory of the Uaid, and the local rulers were compelled to submit. Hostages were handed over, a clear sign of political surrender. These successes carried symbolic weight as well as military importance. Armagh had long been closely tied to the influence of the northern dynasties, particularly the Senel Neogain. Now it was aligning itself with a powerful ruler from the distant south. That shift was deeply humiliating for Flaithbertach. It was not just a territorial setback. It was a blow to prestige and authority. Flaithbertach did not ignore it. His response was swift and aggressive. He launched attacks into the lands of the Aileach, targeting groups that had accepted Brian's authority. One clash near Lough Brickland ended in a clear victory for his forces. These raids were more than retaliation. They were an attempt to reassert dominance in a region that had begun to slip away. In 1006, Brian pressed forward again, determined to complete his circuit. This time, he succeeded. Moving through Connaught, he passed into the territory of the Senel Conail and then advanced into the lands of the Senel Neogain. From there, he crossed into the Uaid regions. At the same time, he made concessions to the religious authorities of Armagh, strengthening their support for his claim to rule. This alliance between political ambition and ecclesiastical authority proved highly effective. Armagh, once firmly within the influence of the northern kings, now backed Brian's wider vision of control over the entire island. Even so, Brian's dominance was not absolute. While many rulers submitted, Flaithbertach and his northern allies refused to yield fully. Hostages were taken from some regions, but not from the core territories of the Senel Neogain and Senel Conail. The resistance remained alive, even if it was under pressure. Flaithbertach continued to fight back. In 1007, he invaded the Uaid again, capturing hostages and killing one of their leading rulers. This act forced Brian to return north and reassert control. In a calculated move, Brian took away one of the hostages who had been held under Senel Neogain authority, turning the political leverage back in his favour. For a brief period there was relative calm, but the underlying tension never disappeared. Flaithbertach launched further raids into Brega, extracting tribute and demonstrating that he was still a force to be reckoned with. Eventually, Brian moved decisively. In 1010, he advanced into the region once more and forced Flaithbertach to submit. The King of Aileach had little choice. He acknowledged Brian's authority and handed over hostages. It was a moment of political reality. Resistance had limits, and Brian's power had become overwhelming. To secure this new arrangement, Brian strengthened the bond through marriage. Flaithbertach took one of Brian's daughters as his wife, part of a wider strategy in which Brian used family ties to bind former rivals to him. Another of his daughters was married to the King of Dublin, showing that this policy extended across both Irish and Norse power structures. Yet such alliances did not guarantee loyalty. They created temporary stability, not permanent unity. Among the northern dynasties, not everyone accepted Flaithbertach's submission. Ambition remained strong, particularly among rival branches who saw an opportunity to challenge his authority. At the same time, In 1011, he joined Brian's forces in a major operation against the Sinel Conile, capturing large numbers of cattle and prisoners. A fleet supported the campaign, allowing the invading army to operate effectively in difficult terrain. Eventually, the resisting king was forced to submit. For the first time, a high king had managed to bring every part of Ireland under his authority in a meaningful way. But this unity did not last. Flaithbertach's loyalty was short-lived. By 1012, he was again in open opposition. He launched raids into neighbouring territories, likely seeking to rebuild alliances among the northern dynasties. His actions suggest a clear intention to challenge Brian's dominance once more. However, this time he struggled to gather the support needed for a coordinated resistance. Political ties that Brian had carefully constructed prevented a unified northern front. At the same time, Flaithbertach struck into the lands of the Uleid again, taking large numbers of cattle and captives. These raids were bold, but they did not fundamentally alter the balance of power. Brian responded by sending forces into Senel Neogain territory. The royal centre at Tulach Ok was burned, a symbolic and strategic blow. Flaithbertach retaliated with raids into Meath, forcing his enemies to withdraw. The conflict had become a cycle of attack and counterattack, with neither side able to secure a decisive advantage. By 1013, the wider political situation had begun to unravel. Brian now faced rebellion from the King of Dublin, Sitric Silkenbeard. Although both Sitric and Flaithbertach opposed Brian, there is no clear evidence that they coordinated their actions. Old rivalries and blood feuds made such cooperation unlikely. Flaithbertach's rebellion seems to have been driven by his own ambitions and by a belief that Brian had no rightful claim to the high kingship, which had traditionally belonged to the Huinel. The crisis reached its peak in 1014 at the famous Battle of Clontarf. Flaithbertach remained distant from the conflict, choosing not to commit his forces. The battle itself was fought between Brian's army and a coalition of Viking and Irish forces. It ended in victory for Brian's side, but at a heavy cost. Brian himself was killed, along with his son. The battlefield was covered in the dead of both sides. In the aftermath, Flaithbertach showed a more measured side. He allowed the body of Brian to be brought north for burial in Armagh, accompanied by clergy and sacred relics. The funeral rites were carried out with honour, and Brian was laid to rest with dignity. Despite their political conflict, Flaithbertach fulfilled his duty as a son-in-law and as a king aware of the importance of such rituals. With Brian gone, the balance of power shifted again. Maelsech Niall resumed the high kingship and Flaithbertach supported him. In return, he likely expected to succeed him in time. Over the following years, Flaithbertach took part in campaigns alongside the High King, raiding Leinster and attacking Dublin. These operations showed that he remained an active and capable leader. Yet tensions persisted. At times, relations between Flaithbertach and the High King broke down, leading to renewed conflict. Raids were launched, territories were plundered, and alliances shifted once again. When Maelsech Niall died in 1022, the opportunity Flaithbertach had waited for finally arrived. He moved quickly, launching attacks and taking hostages in an effort to secure the high kingship. But the political landscape had changed. Support from the southern dynasties was weak and new rivals emerged. His campaigns met resistance and his position weakened. Eventually, he abandoned his attempt to claim the high kingship. The decision marked a turning point, not just for him personally, but for the wider history of the Uinale. The long tradition of alternating high kings between northern and southern branches was coming to an end. In the years that followed, Flaithbertach gradually withdrew from active power. He installed his son as King of Aileach and set out on pilgrimage to Rome, a journey that reflected both personal devotion and a shift away from political ambition. When he returned, he lived more quietly, though he still took part in occasional campaigns to maintain authority in his lands. After his son's death, he briefly resumed the kingship before his own death in 1036. By this time, the world had changed. The Viking threat that had once dominated the north had largely faded. Large-scale raids on inland centres like Armagh were no longer a constant danger. Scandinavian influence remained, but it took different forms. Instead of invasions, there were now alliances, trade, and occasional expeditions across the Irish Sea. In the later 11th century, Scandinavian involvement in the region often came through royal ventures. Fleets from Norway and other northern lands appeared from time to time, sometimes aiming at England, sometimes moving through the Irish Sea. These expeditions were less about settlement and more about power struggles among kings. One story tells of a Norwegian leader who operated from Dublin, forming alliances with local rulers and launching raids into Wales. According to tradition, a dispute over plunder led to a violent clash, ending in the destruction of an entire force. The details may be exaggerated, but the pattern is clear. The old Viking world had not disappeared. It had simply transformed. What had once been an age of sudden raids and violent expansion had become a more complex network of political and military relationships. Irish kings, Norse rulers, and foreign adventurers all moved within this shifting landscape. Flaithbertach Uanail lived at the turning point between these worlds, shaped by the last great struggles of the Viking Age and witnessing the emergence of a new and more interconnected political order. After the death of Flaithbertach Uanail, the Uanail family entered a long period of decline that lasted for more than a century. For a dynasty that had already become one of the earliest and most prestigious surname-bearing families in Ireland, the fall was striking. By the 11th century, the name was famous, respected, and deeply tied to the political identity of the North. Yet the collapse of the family's power was not caused by one great defeat or one dramatic act of dispossession. The reason was much simpler and far more destructive. Too many young men from the ruling line died before they could establish themselves. Some died of illness, others were killed by rivals, and the result was the same. The family kept losing promising heirs before they had the age, influence, or military backing needed to defend their position. In a political world where strength had to be proved again and again, that kind of generational loss was devastating. Once other branches of the Senel Neogain gained control, they were able to exclude the Uanail line from the kingship for generations. The family itself did not disappear. It remained in the region of Tuathail Och and likely continued to be regarded as a noble and ancient branch of the wider dynasty. But its political importance faded so deeply that even the deaths of its leading men stopped being regularly recorded. For about a century, the historical trail grows faint, and what remains is little more than a line of descent preserved by later tradition. The pattern of loss can be seen clearly in the generation after Flaithbertach. One son, Aied Ua Nail, who had ruled in Aileach, died of natural causes in 1033. Another, Domnall Ua Nail, had already died in 1027. A third, Muireadach, was killed in the late 1030s, and another record may preserve the same event in fuller form, describing him and a local king burned to death inside a house set on fire by enemies. A fourth son, Muirchetas, died during a raid into Brega when his retreat went wrong and his party was trapped by the incoming tide along the coast. 4 sons lost in so short a span would have been a crippling blow to any ruling family in medieval Ireland. It becomes even more serious when the wider family is considered. Flaithbertach himself may have had no brothers to reinforce the line, because his father had been killed years before. The annals also preserve the deaths of young men from the branch descended from Flaithbertach's uncle, another king of Aileach. One of those sons was killed by the Dal Riata. Another, described as a likely future king, died in a local dispute within Senil Neogain territory. A further relative from yet another branch was killed by a neighbouring ruler. One by one, the pool of viable successors was drained away. By the time Flaithbertach died, the dynasty faced a serious succession crisis. The last clearly prominent Uar Nail noble to appear in the record during this dark stretch was a Muirchertach Uar Nail, killed in the 1060s. Even by then, his exact descent was already uncertain. The weakening of the main Uar Nailion line opened the way for collateral branches of the Senil Neogen to seize the kingship of Aileach and the important sub-kingship of Tuathail Och. These men were not treated as outsiders or usurpers. They came from branches of the same wider royal stock, and their claims were acceptable within the political customs of the dynasty. Among the main beneficiaries were descendants of Conaing, brother of the famous Muirchertach of the leather cloaks, as well as descendants of Domnall de Baile, some of whom had never before produced kings for the Senil Neogain. The most important rivalry that emerged was between two brothers, Neil and Lochline, both descended from Domnall de Baile. Their branch probably originated in the Tuathail Och region, but by the early 11th century its influence was widening. When Niall killed his brother Lochline, for reasons that are now unknown, the dead man is described as Lord of Inishowen and Mag Ether. That small detail matters, because it seems to mark the beginning of a new association between Lochline's descendants and the Inishowen Peninsula. In time, that connection would become highly important. Yet in the immediate aftermath, it was Niall who profited most. He rose as King of Aileach and asserted control over Tuathail Och as well, even driving out his own nephew from the local kingship there. In that place, he installed a ruler from another collateral line, the Uar Fergail family, showing how far power had shifted away from the old central Uar Neil branch. Neil's position was strong enough to be celebrated in learned tradition. He appears as a major king of Aileach and seems to have been a figure of considerable stature, both politically and physically, in later praise. He was remembered as a renowned ruler, and his image was linked to the great ancestral tradition of Senil Neogain kingship. Yet it was not his descendants who secured the future. Instead, the advantage passed to the line of the nephew he had once displaced. That nephew, Ardgar, son of Lochlin, rebuilt his fortunes dramatically. In the early 1060s, he led a powerful raid into Connaught and returned with enormous booty, including thousands of cattle and large numbers of captives. Such a campaign would have transformed the wealth and standing of his family. When Ardgar died soon afterward, he already held the title King of Aileach. His death took place at Tuathail Och, and he was buried at Armagh in the tomb associated with kings, a sign that his authority had become fully recognised. From that point onward, it was the descendants of Lochline, now known as the Mac Lochlan family, who took command of the kingship and reshaped its future. Ardgar's son, Domnall mac Lochlan, went even further. He broke with the older custom by restricting succession more tightly within his own immediate family, instead of allowing the broader collateral pattern that had long characterised Senil Neogain kingship. This was a major shift in royal practice. It strengthened his own branch, but it also caused deep resentment among other noble lines. Domnall also took direct control of the royal lands in Inishowen for the benefit of his family. Under his rule, Derry began to rise into one of the major ecclesiastical centres of Ireland, and for much of his long reign he stood among the most powerful rulers on the island, even if he never fully secured the high kingship in the strongest sense. His grandson, Muirchertach, MacLachlan, came even closer. He did become High King, though one whose rule was never free from resistance. By then, the MacLachlan line had transformed itself from a collateral branch into the dominant force within Senel Neogan. It was only toward the end of that MacLachlan ascendancy that the Ua Nail family began to reappear in the historical record. Ironically, the very policies that had allowed the MacLachlans to dominate eventually weakened them. By concentrating the kingship within a narrow ruling circle, they alienated much of the wider Senel Neogan population. Support began to drift back toward the old senior line, the Ua Nail family, whose long eclipse had not erased its prestige. Other noble families also attracted backing from time to time, but the memory of the Ua Nail line remained powerful. Its survival through a century of obscurity meant that when dissatisfaction with the MacLachlans grew, there was still an older and more traditional branch waiting in the background. The family had not vanished. It had endured, diminished, but not destroyed, until political conditions once again made its return possible.